Hey everybody, I'm Echo33 and I'm a generative artist. Welcome to Send It, this crazy podcast where we go deep into the intersection of art and technology.
We're bringing you stories with artists, curators, tech founders, and visionaries. Like what was the moment where you're like, okay, this is way more interesting than all the other contemporary art on the market currently?
Once I was reading an essay about generative photography and I was like, wow, generative photography. That's a very interesting expression. And I was starting to dig into that. And then I realized this is like something very special in the history of art that nobody has ever talked about. And or very few people were talking about these topics at that time. But I believe that we're living in a digital age where the everything is being digitized. At that time, we didn't have NFTs yet. We didn't have many things yet. Also the AI movement came a little bit later. But I was quite certain that this is something relevant.
What is generative photography for you?
Well, generative photography, the expression was coined by Gottfried Jäger in 1968 with an art exhibition of the same name at the Kunsthalle Bielefeld. And the idea was to create, not to take photographs, but to make photographs. So have a constructive mathematical method using all the photochemical and methods and photo technical methods to create something that looks like a mathematical structure, like concrete art. At the time, they didn't use computers. They were creating their own little machines, or some of them were creating even very large machines. And then in 1975, there was a book called Generative Photography, which was written by Gottfried Jäger, Karl Martin Holzhäuser, and Herbert Franke. And that book was an encyclopedia of all the methods you could use to create photographs.
I always think of AI art, or if you can call it that, is like generative photography, just with new machines.
Yeah, absolutely. For me, the beginning of AI was generative photography, in my opinion, because that was the first time that you were using photographic methods to generate artworks. And nowadays you also use pictures. AI is based on photographs at the end of the day. In most cases, I'm not talking about ChatGPT, but like Midjourney or whatever. These AI tools, they are trained on photographs. And so there is certainly a certain link, although generative photography looks completely different than AI nowadays. But if you want to go back to the birth of all this, you would have to go back to the 60s.
I remember, George, we were in Miami a few months ago and you were telling me about AI art, and I believe you said something very interesting to me, which was like, yes, AI art is like the opportunity of a lifetime for collectors. Do you still think this is standing? Because we know everything is changing very fast. And if that's the case, how would you recommend a collector to start collecting AI art in a significant way?
Yeah, I think I'm not the only one who sees it like that. I was just reading an article on Artsy, and I've reading several articles about the AI art market, especially young collectors. They feel very attached to this medium, and there's a lot of currently, if you look around the digital art market, I would say the strongest sales you can see in AI. And interestingly, a lot of the collectors are really looking into this historical evolution of AI from the past 10 years. So it's not necessary always like artists that are being collected, but sometimes really like tech people who have created something that looks like an artwork or that is used later as a tool to create art. And those kind of historical attempts are, for me, very similar to these early photographs, like by Niepce and Talbot, and it's the 19th century, where photography was in the early days, and it was a new technology. And I mean, those early photographs were not that exciting to look at. I mean, they were black and white, they were faded away, but I mean, they are historically important and are in all the collections. And also, you know, for example, Elman Manzinov's A Line Draw is a very good example of such a, you know, like a photograph, as we could say, that was exhibited at Paris Photo and that entered into one of the most important photo museums, the Kodak art collection, you know, in Rochester, and this is the most significant photography collection, and they understood that this is something historical. So AI, I think when we will look back to these early days in 10, 20 years, it's going to be very, very interesting. Like historically, I think it's an amazing opportunity nowadays to experience this history evolving, and to have the chance also to collect these artworks. I mean, some artworks are quite reasonably priced on the market. I'm not talking about the very expensive ones like the Lost Robbies, but there's a lot of interesting artworks out there from 2015 to 2021, 22, something like that. You find a lot of very interesting artworks that you can collect, and you can build like a significant art collection on a topic.
The align draws, I must say, I was personally struggling with the aesthetics of it initially. But when I saw them printed, especially like in Fellowship Gallery in Notting Hill, large scale, wow, this is really changed my mind about the aesthetic like level of the artwork. I encourage. I mean, if you have a chance, I think it's really good to look at the work in large scale. It's changing everything, at least to me.
Yeah, I think Fellowship did an amazing job presenting them also at Paris Photo. I don't know, it was 2 years ago or 3 years ago. It was impressive to see all of them. And yeah, I mean, they did a great job in researching everything, and I think it's not artistically. I think it's interesting. It will age well, I believe, because we will have, you know, we are already seeing like really perfect images created with AI. But I mean, these early days are interesting, where you can see these kind of mistakes or this, you know, these early attempts that came what we see nowadays.
Because my approach to collecting is very much buy whatever I like. And I think you have a very strong focus on what is important in the history of digital art. So I want to know what are things that you think are historical?
I don't know. I'm a very patient collector. When I buy something, for me, it has to be. I have to like it. I have to feel it has a historical value, and I have to be certain that it's not going to lose its value. So these are the three criterias that I look at when I buy an artwork. And I think for me, it's not about buying something and selling it and like flipping it. I rarely sold any artworks, but I'm aware, and I believe I will be right in 10, 15 years that you know, some artworks will become very valuable. I'm pretty sure the ones that are historical turning points, especially, you know, these AI artworks at the moment, are very interesting for me. Early blockchain artworks, I think they don't necessarily have to be NFTs. There's also a lot of physical artworks, digital artworks that have a physical component that are going to be very valuable. Quite sure, and we're just discovering this whole history from the 60s, 50s, 60s till now, and we seeing a lot of museum exhibitions, books. I think in the next few decades, digital art will be also part of the general art history books. Currently I don't know any art history books that have included also digital art. Most of them just write about conceptual art and minimalism and what so forth, but they miss out on this whole history that is also important digital art from the 60s,
Looking at, for example, if we think about Harold Cohen, who is like a obvious name as a pioneer of AI and generative art at the same time, I'm sure we're missing other artists from this era working with some of this kind of conceptual approach and maybe some of these tools. Are you aware of anyone we should definitely reconsider? Because to me, it feels like, if I risk the parallel, it's a little bit like Vera Molnar to generative art and Harold Cohen to AI art. I'm kind of making the same comparison points, but actually there was obviously much more than Vera Molnar and earlier as well. What could we say about AI art and Harold Cohen, and what could we miss today?
Well, as you know, I'm working on an exhibition at the moment, on the Paintbox exhibition. That's a good example. There's a lot of unknown artists there that were pioneers in the 80s, and at the moment, probably people are just discovering it, looking at it. But at some point, we will understand that this was also an important era. There's a net art movement. There's amazing artists like Ubermorgen, for example, who were totally undervalued, in my opinion. It's not just generative art and not just AI. There's digital painting, there's glitch art, there's conceptual art, CO art, and so forth. And I think all these artists that have been at the forefront of one of these segments of digital art, they will make it into the history books, I think.
SEO art must be quite challenging to archive, though.
To restore, yes.
Yes.
Restoration is generally a big problem in digital art, and especially also with NFTs, we will see a lot of problems coming up in the maybe 10 years or something. I still think the best is if you collect digital art, to have a physical as well. So sometimes you have the possibility to claim both, to have a NFT and the physical work. So I think it's not so stupid to have both, but certainly with the physical artworks, you might have a storage problem if you're collecting a lot. I think also, for me, like plotter drawings from the 60s is something that is very valuable, this historically so important, and there's not that many artworks still left, from the era. So that's something that I'm also very interested in.
When you look at these old pioneers, I immediately think of Renaissance men like Herbert Franke, who nature and science meets art. And he also was an author, writing very early sci-fi books, and really used a lot of science to produce art. Can you talk more about this era, and what do you think about this idea of Renaissance men in the digital era?
Yeah, Herbert was an exceptional personality, because the amount of books that he wrote, a lot of people don't even read as many books that he wrote in their lifetime. So it's just really amazing. And then also that he kept up with each new technology. So his artistic style always changed when a new technology came up. So I mean, he did plotter drawing, he did oscillograms, he also experimented with virtual reality. I mean, it was a very fascinating personality, and I mean, he also, he actually wrote the first history book on digital art in the early 70s. So a lot of the sources that we have about that history are really coming from that book, or it's always mentioned. I think, yeah, I mean, he was an exceptional artist, but there were also other exceptional artists at the time. I think, I mean, for me, all of them are really exceptional, because what they did at that time was not like sitting at a computer and code. I mean, they had to have access to these machines at universities or big companies, usually only in the evening when they didn't use it. So like Vera Molnar, she was using these computers at night, to create her plotter drawings. And I think, yeah, I mean, they had to have an imagination. They had to know how to code. I mean, it was really yeah, it was not comparable to now, because now almost everybody has access to a computer. You have all kinds of softwares to use, and that was completely different at that time. So I think for me, those artworks are very, very valuable. You're speechless.
Jean-Jacques?
I wanted to let you speak if you had anything. I think your project, because 1 year ago, I remember we were like in Miami around this swimming pool. There was like this conference. You say, hey, I found this like very unique computer, which was very rare at the time. It was used by top artists of the moment, and I'm going to recreate a new project with that. I remember it left me, I was like, wow, this is extremely interesting. And I'm still fascinated today, and I would love to learn more about what you started to mention just before, which is the paint box, where it's coming from, and what you're working on today. I think it's a very interesting to show, I think, your practice as a curator to kind of excavate these almost artifacts from this old era, but early days of computers and art, and making it at the forefront of what we can do today.
Yeah, I mean, it's actually fascinating for me. It's a very special exhibition because it's about a tool. It's almost like I would do an art exhibition on the pencil, or on a oil paint or whatever, and show its evolution. And this is a computer graphic tool, so it's a hardware software combination which was developed before Adobe Photoshop. So Adobe Photoshop came after this, and I think they copied a lot of the features. And it was used for broadcasting first. All the broadcasting studios like BBC, ABC, etc. They bought paint boxes, and it was very expensive at the time. I think it cost like £250,000 or something, which would be now almost $1 million. Yeah, and so they used it for weather forecast, whatever, and then some people were trained as artists on this paint box. So there was a company called Electric Paint in California, which no longer exists, but that company was producing a lot of the film posters for Hollywood, Pulp Fiction, or Silence of the Lambs, JFK, The Doors, etc. I mean, all these really famous film posters, and also some record covers. And then also, the whole MTV era. I mean, all these colors that we know of were actually colors from Paintbox. These MTV logos were created with the Paintbox. They were making music videos, etc. And then there were a few artists, and it's kind of the same situation as in the 60s. These few artists that had access to these big machines. Here also, you had to I mean, it was you couldn't just let artists work on these machines because it was a valuable time, to use them. So they made a documentary where they invited some of the most well-known artists of the time, like David Hockney, Richard Hamilton, Larry Rivers, and so forth. So there were 6 artists invited to paint on the paint box, and they were recording it. There was very few artists that even owned a paint box, like Richard Hamilton. Richard Hamilton did quite a few artworks on the paint box. Some of them are also very well known, and they are in big museum collections like the Tate Modern. And yeah, I think. And then there were a few other artists that somehow had access. But I mean, with this exhibition, we're trying to show some of these important artworks that were created on the paint box in 1980s, especially, and early 90s. And yeah, we are lucky that we have a few such original paint boxes that we can use, and we have been doing this paint box world tour where we went to different cities like Miami and Paris. We're gonna go to Los Angeles. We're in New York, and so we invited artists, contemporary artists, to create some new artworks. And I was first a little bit skeptical. I wasn't sure whether this is gonna work out, whether artists would be interested at all. And to my fascination, it was amazing how almost every artist was just fascinated. Some of them were just sitting there for hours and creating something, and yeah, I mean, it's fascinating to see how it's almost like taking an old photo camera, and invite artists to work on that. I mean, this kind of fascination and creativity that is flourishing when they see this machine and they start to work on it, and you can actually see how I'm fascinated that an artist sits there and just creates, and it's just the creativity. I mean, even in 10 minutes, like I was watching Andrea Chiampo drawing on it, and I was just blown away what he did in like 10-15 minutes. It's as good as a Ernst Ludwig Kirchner drawing, so
Do you know if Charles Xui worked with the paint box at all? Or?
Charles Chury actually developed, I think, his own kind of technology. It was also some sort of a software, I think. I don't think he worked on the paint box, but I might be mistaken.
As an artist just using it, because I mean, from like timing wise, it's kind of like there's like a big overlap of like when the paint box was used and what Charles was working. So I'm thinking, how could he not use the paint box? But I'm not aware of any works, but I was curious to know if you
I would
would.
have to inquire, but I don't think I wouldn't be aware of it. But I mean, there are artists like Andreas Gursky, for example. He did some works, or Keith Haring.
And do you know, you mentioned like some of the works are in the Tate collection. I mean, do you know other works being part of some collections or being owned by private collectors today? It's interesting to see how like all the digital artworks are still available today.
Almost all the museums own artworks that have been made on the paint box. The MoMA, the Pompidou, they all have artworks. Some of them don't even know that they were made on the paint box. So it's yeah. I mean, it must have been a very common tool in the 80s and 90s. I mean, in France, there were a few artists that created artworks, like Kiki Picasso, for example. It was very prolific. I also talked to an artist who's living in Holland, and she said that there were a lot of artists working on the paint box. So it's kind of like an ongoing research on this whole topic. We're gonna show some of the highlights in Basel, but I'm pretty much aware that I mean, this is just, still at the surface. This whole topic I could probably research for 3 years, and there's so much
Something.
to find still, and that we're not aware of. But we luckily there are a few museums who have we've been in touch with, so that we might see also some museum exhibitions which will highlight some angles of it. We're actually going to include a paint box and some artworks at Rhizome this spring.
Cool. Okay.
So they have a new space, and so we will set up a paint box there, and some artists will be invited to create artworks on spot.
Do you think that because institutions like museums, it's not easy for them to kind of take custody of digital artworks as like crypto tokens? What makes me think this is like a very unique situation is that digital works created by a paint box in the 80s or the 90s are still in museum collections today, when contemporary digital art is really difficult to get into museums because of custodial issues. So would the best way would be to just let's say print digital work, so that's the best medium to get it into museums? I don't know, this is kind of open question for me.
Yeah, the artworks from the 80s, these paint box artworks were also, they couldn't save it on a disc or something. So some artworks only survived as transparencies, like as negatives. So, and then there's also this kind of questions: is this the artwork? Is this a reproduction of the artwork? What is the artwork essentially? So we're having these discussions. I think nowadays, I totally agree that museums are afraid of taking. Because a museum is it's not just about buying an artwork and exhibiting artwork, but it's also about preserving it for the future. So that's why they are reluctant when it comes to digital art, because it's just being so fast with the technology. Before it was more, let's say, the hardware technology that you had to preserve, and nowadays it's probably more the software technology, and preserving websites, preserving some file formats might not exist anymore.
When we started working together on a certain project, on an exhibition, I believe, my opinion about art, growing up, I couldn't care less. I thought, who the hell is stupid enough to buy a Picasso for 20 million and waste that kind of money? Suddenly, you almost infected me with a certain passion for art. But I think it has to do with obviously financial manipulation, but also passion, a certain amount of passion. When you go, do your daily work, you basically live for art. What are moments, or what is an example where you're like, this is just insane? Like, wow, I've witnessed some, but what comes to mind?
It's kind of interesting, these moments. Sometimes you capture this moment, but you capture it in an early day, and it doesn't. Nothing happens. I remember the CryptoPunks. That was one of the moments where I knew that this is something. This is something very substantial. But at the time, it was not. Yeah, wasn't that significant.
What did you love about it so much?
I don't know. It was this aesthetic. I thought it's so. It reminded me of Andy Warhol. I saw this kind of pop culture behind it. It was also technically innovative at that time. That was kind of like I think the first ERC 721, or it was the predecessor of the 721 token. standard. So I knew, it was also the time when, CryptoPunks, CryptoKitties, that was a big buzz in the whole blockchain world because people were talking about digital ownership of art, so you have this possibility to have a unique digital artwork that you can own. And so that was a big buzz, although I have to say, in the early days, I was consulting a few NFT platforms, and these platforms were selling art for like $20-$30. Also, Larva Labs. I remember we had to put some Larva Labs artworks on one of these platforms, and nobody bought it for $20-$30. And they were kind of, their business model was to get like 15% of the sales, and I was always saying, how do you want to make money? And I had no idea that it could, become so expensive. That people would pay hundreds of thousands for an NFT. I mean, it was. But I felt that, this moment, and some of these artists were creating substantial art, but sometimes substantial art is not necessarily also expensive. The market, I think, works differently because there's usually some art collectors who are pushing and building a market, and yeah, it's a consensus between a few art collectors who fill their bags and manipulate an art market. Yeah, so it can be, it's seen with I guess the Lost Robbies is one example where, an amazing price has been established, or the autoglyphs. I don't know whether it's manipulation, but it's certainly there's certain powers behind it that can hold these values.
It's interesting to highlight that looking at it from the outside, digital art world today might look hyper financialized, like super like investment driven, speculative, and so on, which arguably could be said same thing to the traditional art world. But anyways, looking at it from the outside, think, oh, this is just like money grab. Whereas in the beginning, it was everything but that, just what you said. I mean, CryptoPunks like free to mint, or then they could be claimed for $20-$30, and Lost Robbies being given for free. I think the history of the movement of the contemporary digital art space is not defined as money only, I think.
Well, I'm sometimes surprised, artists are very money driven, a lot of, and I mean, some artists they would rather make more money, and not, produce a book or something or whatever. I mean, in the traditional art world, it was like it's important to have exhibitions, it's important to be in museums, it's important to produce books. The digital artists, it's important to make money. I have the feeling sometimes, and some projects have really. I had some experiences where artists just thought they don't get enough money, so they didn't collaborate on an exhibition or something or whatever, And I think that kind of changed. I'm not sure whether. I think it's more honest. If you look at Andy Warhol, I mean, he openly said that make art that makes money. I make art that sells. So he was totally capitalistically driven, which is absolutely fine. I mean, in the traditional art market, everybody's just, like, you shouldn't make money, you shouldn't earn any money. But at the end of the day, everybody's in for the money. So it's just so.
I think we're in for the fun as well. At least you and me, George. I don't know Jean-Jacques in the free time enough yet. But when we,
passion, yeah.
when we went, I'm talking about, when we started working together. There was a few longer nights in Miami and a few excursions in the late hours that were fun. What do you think is more fun, the traditional art market or the digital? Like now it's like 2 3 years going on, and I think, I don't know. How do you compare the two?
I think I think there's more honest and more serious discussions about art in the digital art market, I would say, or the digital art scene. There's a lot of interest. I'm surprised, the collectors are much younger, the people involved, and they're very interested. They're super. There's a lack of literacy still, because they're young, so they still have to learn about art history. Also visit some museums and read some books. But the interest is really, really huge. I see it also at our conferences that we are organizing. People come there to learn about art. It's not for the champagne. And I like that. Certainly there's also some parties going on, but I would say in the traditional art world, a lot of the collectors are not. I mean, they're really just buy art to show off, or they're not so interested really in to learn. I find it a little bit different, and I also find the art really dull sometimes. I kind of left the traditional art space many years ago because I thought it was not inspiring, and I didn't understand why.
Let's say, George, there's like a traditional art collector who is willing to learn more about digital art because he feels completely alienated by all of that. If there's one thing this person should do, what would you recommend it to be?
You have to go down the rabbit hole. It's a lot of it's a big learning process, and I'm coming from the traditional art world. I don't know how to code. I'm not that technical as people would think. But I learned a lot. I exchanged with a lot of very smart coders, and they taught me things. And you have to understand the complexity and the production process behind an artwork.
There is this like massive rabbit hole, and you're like, okay, just I know it is somewhere. How do you make the first step?
Or what was like your point where it's like, wow, I need to look at this?
Well, quite frankly, there was a time where I felt that I'm coming from the traditional art world, and I went through everything there, from old masters to photography to contemporary art, modern art, etc. But there was a time where I felt, "Ooh, this is just not, I didn't see any art anymore." And then I went to these meetups, on these blockchain meetups and crypto meetups, and I met all these people, and they were entrepreneurs, and I thought, wow, these people are creative. They are so much more creative than any artist that I'm meeting in the traditional art world. And I started to exchange and learn about different blockchains, learn about all the technicalities, and and then that's how I got into it. I got hooked up with it.
Maybe, and I'm not saying this because you are organizing it, but maybe the next best thing they can do would be to go to the digital art mile during Art Basel.
Yeah, we're trying to bridge these two worlds. We're trying to make digital art interesting for a wider public. That's why we are in Basel. Because we want to reach out to everyone who's interested in art, whether you are in digital art or whether you are in you're there for Art Basel or any other fair. So that's our goal, to fascinate people about these topics. There's conferences that are easy approachable for a wider public, and maybe there's some panel discussions which are more like sophisticated as well. You need to have a bit of a tech knowledge, but I think we are balancing it out. And also, we have this year we have a conference for corporate collections and for museums as well. So we're trying to build these bridges there's not many corporate collections out there that are into digital art already. This is a golden opportunity for them to make a first step and learn about a few things before they start building their collections. The museums are already experimenting with webs, but we are making these conferences as annual conferences and trying to build these bridges. And also at the art fair we have exhibitors that show NFTs. Others are showing physical digital art or installations. There's a wide spectrum, so people can see that digital art is not just NFTs. I mean, it's a much bigger topic.
Thank you.
Yes.
And maybe one last question. With your art historian hat on, let's project us like 20 years from now. And if we look back, what could potentially be obvious that we don't see today? I'm not speaking about undervalued artist collections. It can be like a broad, big things. If there is like potentially an elephant in the room that we don't see, let's imagine ourselves in 20 years, and any ideas or suggestions of what could that be looking like?
Well, for me, I like to use this term, the golden age of blockchain art and AI. And that's the period, I would say, from like 2011, maybe, with the very early blockchain, like NFTs, the Punicos and other NFTs, till 2021. But I would say mainly between, like, let's say 2015 till 2021. This is a period that I'm particularly interested in, because that was this was the early days of two technologies that were evolving. One was AI with the early GANs, deep dreams, style transfer, etc. All these things that were evolving from 2015 till we had this kind of perfection in AI, which was maybe around, I don't know, 2022 or something, I don't know. And in NFTs, it was probably, also, I think 2014, 15, there were a lot of these early important artworks by Ria Myers, Kevin Abosch, Van den Dorpel, and all these artists who did quite a few interesting things in these days. And then till, let's say, 2021, when we had this boom. So this is a historical period, and I like to call it the golden age. And there's a lot of great things that happened in those days. That's my research focus. Some things are more important than others. Some things will be discovered over the years. I mean, there's a lot of research being done now in AI. A lot of things are being discovered. I was reading about this research on Alec Radford, for example, who was kind of like a genius brain. And there's others as well, I mean, there's a lot of great visionaries that have created something that was important in the evolution of a genre that will probably be, in the next few decades we will see more digital art, I'm sure. I mean, AI is certainly something that is going to be everywhere in our lives. And I mean, AI art, I mean, for me, this is quite logical that is a very, very big movement. And the same with blockchain, although I'm not sure, maybe blockchain will be replaced by something else in the future, I don't know. But I think at the moment it's also one of these technologies that is that promises to solve a lot of problems. Yeah, let's see what the future will bring. But I think at the moment these two things I'm looking at, yeah, very specifically, especially 2015 to 2021 is really my focus.